and welcome to the fifth and final video in this How to Play series for Prime Minister by GMT Games. And in this video, we're going to cover some topics that only relate to multiplayer games of Prime Minister. But it's also one of the more unique and unusual features of the game, which is a concept called VP pooling. And it has a lot to do with pacts and resignations, which we'll talk about in conjunction with VP pooling as we go through this video. But at base, what VP pooling means is that any VP that you as a player score in the game are shared with other players who are in the same VP pool as you. And a VP pool, depending on the status of pacts, resignations, can include 2, 3, or all 4 players. So to understand it, we really need to talk about it, as I've said, in relation to pacts and resignations. So we're going to cover all of it together here. But to start with, in standard multiplayer games, the pact card, this card, is placed on the board during setup to indicate that the government and opposition are in a pact. And when the government and opposition are in a pact, it means that they pool their victory points. They pool their VP. Any VP scored by any player in the game is shared by everyone, no exceptions. What that also means is that at the start of the game, only the Prime Minister's player marker is on the score track. And that marker represents everyone's victory point score. You won't place other players' markers on the score track until the pool breaks up. By staying in the pact, the opposition is getting extra victory points. At the start of a round, 4 victory points are given to the government and 2 victory points to the opposition. These victory points are combined during a pact, so the government party is not pulling ahead of the opposition while the pact is in effect. And how that plays out, at the beginning of a round, the government would score victory points, so this marker would move along the track. And the opposition would gain 2 victory points, and so it would move along the track again. And this represents that every single player in the game has 6 victory points. The downside of the pact for the opposition is that they cannot attack bills while the pact is in effect. You can't use the debate action to move support for the bill down, and you can't use an influence action without the Prime Minister's permission. There are 2 ways of ending the pact. The first is that during the action phase, the opposition leader may simply withdraw from the pact. The other way is that the Prime Minister can end the pact by placing a party bill on the board. The timing of this move is a really key strategic decision in the game. It could happen in the first round before any victory points are scored, or it could happen after several rounds. When the pact ends, 2 things happen. The first is that the opposition leader takes the pact card and they're going to hold on to it. The second thing is that the opposition leader takes their player marker and they place it on top of the Prime Minister's marker on the score track. From this point forward, the government and the opposition track their victory points separately. We now have 2 VP pools, 1 for each party. So if we think back to the example we were talking about the beginning of a round, in this case, the opposition, represented by this green marker, would score 2 victory points, and the government would score 4 victory points. Similar to breaking the pact, there are 2 ways to restart the pact. The opposition leader can unilaterally restart the pact during the bill selection process when there are 3 cross-party bills on the board. Alternately, the Prime Minister and opposition leader can mutually agree to restart the pact at any time when there are no party bills on the board. It may be evident, but it's worth noting that by the time the pact gets restored, it's possible that the person who was the Prime Minister when it was broken is now actually the opposition leader. We talked about challenges, we talked about changeover of government related to elections. So it is not necessarily the person who broke the pact who will restart the pact. And when the pact is restarted, you take the pact card, you're going to flip it over to this side, and you're going to replace it on the board. And while VPs are now pooled, because the cubes have diverged, they're no longer tracked with a single cube. They are simply moved in unison. So keeping with the example we've been using, if we are at the start of a round and there is now a restarted pact in place, the government would get 16 points and the opposition would get 16 points. The cubes are both moved 6 spaces, although they're not combined on the board. Put another way, restarting a pact or restarting a VP pool doesn't reset anyone's VP score. Opposition players always pool their victory points, either as part of a pact, so they're pooling them with each other and with the government, or separately as the opposition pool. But the opposition players are always in a pool together. The government backbencher is usually in a victory point pool with the prime minister, but the government backbencher has the ability to resign, which removes them from the victory point pool with the prime minister. So the government victory point pool includes the prime minister and the government backbencher if the government backbencher has not resigned. As the government backbencher, you can choose to resign by spending all of your action cubes, placing the resignation card on the board, and then taking your player marker and placing it on top of the PM's marker on the victory point track. The PM immediately loses 2 standing and you lose all of your career cards. From this point forward, you and the prime minister will track your VPs separately. So again, keeping with our example, at the start of a round, the prime minister would score 4 victory points. The opposition would score 2. And as the government backbencher, you wouldn't score any. You don't get any round setup victory points. You don't get victory points after an election. You don't get victory points from bills, but you are now free to attack the government's bills. As you can see, you're gonna start falling behind in victory points if you do this. So why would you do it? Well, usually the purpose of a resignation is to seize the prime minister's mat for yourself by weakening the prime minister. So if we look at the state of the player mats right now, if the government backbencher resigned at this point, they would reduce the prime minister's standing to 5, and now they are ahead in standing. So after the player action rounds, they have the possibility to challenge the prime minister. Of course, it's a gamble because the prime minister could play an event, play a supporter. There are things that the prime minister could do which will increase their standing, which could make it impossible for you to then challenge the prime minister. Late in the game, you might even resign in an effort to bring down the government by making it possible for the opposition leader to challenge them in an effort to bring down the government and forestall a victory by the prime minister. If you succeed in challenging and you take the prime minister's mat after resigning, you get to keep the PM replacement bonus for yourself. Only you score those 6 victory points, but then victory point pooling resumes with the former PM becoming the government backbencher. If you've resigned, you can rejoin the government as a backbencher only with the prime minister's permission. If you're still in the resigned position when the government collapses, when a government changeover occurs, whether that's due to an election or due to a challenge, you'll resume VP pooling with the former PM when you go into the opposition. If you'll recall, opposition VPs are always pooled. Finally, I'll note that page 34 contains a really good guide to VP pooling, and page 35 of the multiplayer rulebook contains a handy chart which helps you keep track of VP pools in the game and their status. So the rulebook, page 34 and 35, are going to be very helpful to help you with pooling. Because of this, because so much VP is shared in the game, you should expect some coordination and cooperation between players, especially players in the same party. And part of the game's strategy is managing your relationships. If you never cooperate with the other players in your party, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. Additionally, and we've already talked about this a little bit, at the end game, betrayal becomes more likely and alliances may shift. You might see the government backbencher conspiring with the opposition to stop the PM from achieving victory, or you might see the two backbenchers conspiring with each other against their party leaders. And what all of this suggests is that you're going to want to consider making decisions in the game jointly. Party leaders can discuss their decisions with their backbenchers. For example, the PM can talk to the backbencher about bill selection and try to decide together which bills they want to place on the board. You can even do that with the opposition leader and the opposition backbencher. Also, you can reveal any supporter cards that you're holding to any players of your choice and plan with them how to use them together. Finally, if you want play that's more cooperative than the standard version or less cooperative than the standard version, take a look at the scenarios. There are scenarios that offer purely cooperative play against automated politicians. There's scenarios that offer cooperative team style play with joint victories. There's games that don't use the pact card at all. There's even a 3-player variant with 3 parties instead of 2. The liberal unionists join the game. With that, we come to the end of this How to Play series for Prime Minister from GMT Games. I hope you found this series of videos helpful. I hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would be great if you can do all the standard things. Subscribe, like, comment, share. The next step in this process is going to be an example of play video, so you can see how all of this plays out in practice and hopefully get a sense for what a game of Prime Minister is like.